this was a period of what was called stagflation. People had not experienced it before, where there was inflation and there was stagnation, unemployment, going side by side. This was, and although, you know, figures of 25% a year don't sound very much, compared with some of the runaway inflations that have been experienced in the world in the 20th century, it is the case that 25% means that the prices in supermarkets are going up 2% every month. Now, citizens of capitalist countries who depend entirely on working for wages in order to meet their consumption needs get very nervous when they find that the money that they're earning is losing its value in that regular fashion. We want to believe that we can rely on the money that we have. And the idea that the money was somehow slipping away was a source of tremendous fear and anxiety to most people. And the right wing seized on this and offered, through Reagan and Thatcher, by the end of the 1970s, 79, 80, they offered an alternative, which they called sound money, low inflation. And they argued really that the problem was that we had relied too heavily on the state, and that the state was the cause of our anxieties. And not only that, the state was the cause of the low level of economic performance. And so the solution was to reduce inflation, to make for a sound monetary policy, and to free the market economy from state control, since it was argued now that the market economy was where capitalist development came from. So this period of the 70s was a transition from the post-war settlement, in which the rich countries made a serious commitment to the poor countries to try and lift them off the floor, as it were, in their own interest as well as in the interest of the poor countries themselves. And then a series of problems in the 1970s, which included not just the oil price, the deflation of demand, the inflation that overtook the Western economies, the crisis that this posed for the state as the principal organizing institution. But it was also the period where the Americans lost the Vietnam War, where the Portuguese were forced to withdraw from the last empire in Africa. And it was also the period when money futures were invented as a way of coping with quite erratic fluctuations in international exchange rates, because the Americans went off the gold standard in 1971, and this produced, this basically released international monetary affairs from the controls that had been imposed on exchange rates after the Second World War. So this was a period of great turbulence and uncertainty, and people in general voted now for a right-wing solution, which said in effect we have to restore the market economy, we have to rely a lot less on the state, and we have to make sure that money is kept under control. Now, in this context, the next two decades were very bad for the poor countries, because one of the, I mean, basically what happened in the 1970s was that the oil producers, especially the Saudis and people like them, made a killing from increased oil prices. And the issue was, what, I mean, these were countries with very few people, and they couldn't spend the money on developing their own people. And there's a limit to how many F-16 fighters you can spend the money on. So they basically had to lend it. They had to put it somewhere where it could earn interest, or put it into the banking system. The banking system couldn't take the money because the Western economies were suffering a recession because of the increased oil price. So there was no demand for investment or loans there. At that time in the Cold War, there was no prospect of lending money to the Russians and their allies in the communist world. And so the only place they could send the money was into the third world. And so what they did, there was this wild banking spree in which people from Morgan Stanley and Credit Lyonnais and Barclays just hopped on planes around the third world and started throwing money at corrupt dictators and other people and saying, how much do you want? I mean, use it for development. Of course, they didn't use it for development. They put it all in Swiss bank accounts. And the whole premise of these loans, which were never supervised in any reasonable way, was that the money would be spent on development, on enriching the economies. But even when it was done in a way that didn't work very well, and most of the time the money was just siphoned off into private consumption. And so there was no, there was no prospect of this money being repaid. And at the end of the 1970s, there were, at a time still of significant inflation, the Americans, the Federal Reserve Bank, the guy in charge of it was called Paul Volcker at that time, they raised interest rates to almost 20% in order to protect the dollar at a time of increased oil prices. And so all these outstanding loans that have been poured into the poor countries and with little prospect of them being repaid, now accumulated huge interest rates, much larger than any that was anticipated at the time. And there were serious banking problems in the Western world. I mean, there were banks in Britain that almost went to the wall and would have gone to the wall. Midland was the most exposed, and you don't hear of that anymore. The Midland had tremendous overexposure in Latin America and was bailed, and they and similar banks were bailed out by national governments, often without making it public what they were doing. But in any case, there was a huge banking crisis, which in the last 20 years has basically been solved to the interest of the in the interest of the rich countries and their banks. And the result, of course, is that many of the poor countries over this period of 20 years have been spending a massive amount of the liquid funds that they have in servicing this debt. And the transfers of wealth from the poor to the rich countries in this period, as I've said, has been higher than at any previous time in the checkered relationship between the rich and poor countries of the world. So in this context, it's clearly hypocritical to argue, you know, that the West continues to have an interest in the development of the poor countries. I mean, the West not only has been stealing all this money, which to some extent Western banking customers ought to have been forced to pay, because their banks, after all, lent the money under reckless and unsupervised conditions, and then basically forced the poor governments of the world to hand over a third of their annual budgets or more to pay off these interest repayments. This situation, I mean, clearly cannot be represented as the rich countries helping the poor countries to become richer. I mean, this is quite the opposite of that. And of course, in the 1940s and 50s, the Western countries made some modest commitments to spend, let's say, 0.7% of their gross national product on aid. Of course, this expenditure has not been met. And in fact, most of the Western countries are now spending much less on development than they did in the period when I think development was more of a realistic proposition. And instead, I mean, development is cosmetic. People go out there and, I don't know, run some poxy little scheme to help AIDS victims or something, which may or may not be a benefit to a few people on the ground, but which has nothing to do with economic development.